Hello, everyone. I'm Lana Zach. Thank you so much for joining me. Jury deliberations in the Derek Chauvin murder trial could begin as early as Monday, as the nation waits to see if the former officer will be convicted in the death of George Floyd. Both the prosecution and defense are set to make their closing remarks in the morning. We've heard testimony from witnesses of the deadly arrest, police officers, use of force experts, and medical professionals. But as a high-profile trial comes to a close, the country is once again grappling with new cases of police violence and brutality. Protesters have filled the streets throughout the weekend in Minneapolis, Chicago, New York, and Washington. Many are calling for justice after 20-year-old Daunte Wright was killed by an officer a week ago, and investigators released video of the shooting death of 13-year-old Adam Toledo. Joining me now is CBSN legal contributor Jessica Levinson from Los Angeles. Jessica, closing arguments begin on Monday. You have been following this every step of the way. Do you think that the prosecution will replay the 9 minutes and 29-second video of Floyd dying as they did in their opening statements?
I think they might, because that really has changed the case in so many ways. The fact that we have video in this case, obviously, it's why we're talking about it. It's why it is, a new kind of trial of the century. So might they show it again and say, we showed this at the beginning, we explained everything that happened, and we want to remind you again, you can believe your eyes and ears. What happened in that video of George Floyd being on the ground, being restrained, and dying as a result of Officer Chauvin, you can believe that that happened because we've just told you over the last 3 weeks that you can trust yourself. So they need to be a little bit careful that the jury doesn't get into a place where they feel desensitized from seeing the video too many times. I don't think they're there yet, but if I had one criticism of the prosecution, it's that they're at the verge of kind of overplaying their hand. They're at the verge of over-trying their case.
Speaking of, that's the prosecution, but let's talk about the defense a little bit. What type of strategy do you think the defense will try and use?
I think the defense is going to keep saying to the jury, you saw this, but we have explained to you that there are other reasons why George Floyd might have died. I think the defense is going to continue with this kind of throw the spaghetti against the wall, hope that one piece of the spaghetti sticks, because again, the defense has a really different role here. The prosecution has to get a unanimous verdict that beyond a reasonable doubt, all 12 jurors agree that Officer Chauvin either is guilty of second or third degree murder or second degree manslaughter. The defense has a really different role here, which is that they just have to convince one of the jurors that they have some reasonable doubt. And again, that's a much lower threshold. So I think you're going to see the defense say, are we absolutely sure that, and then they're going to focus, I believe, on this medical issue, this substantial cause issue. Are we absolutely sure it wasn't George Floyd's pre-existing conditions? Are we absolutely sure it wasn't the drug use? Are we absolutely sure it wasn't, and then fill in the blank? Because again, for the defense, a win really is a hung jury.
Well, what would happen next for Chauvin in the event of either a guilty verdict or an acquittal or, as you're saying, a hung jury?
So in the event of a guilty verdict, he would be going, I believe, to prison. There will be appeals. I watched the trial. At this point, I don't see that there would be an appeal that would overturn the verdict. Now, it's always hard to predict. We have to make sure that the jury instructions are proper. But at this point, I don't see that the prosecution has given room for an appeal that would, again, overturn the verdict. So he would be facing significant prison time. If there's an acquittal or a hung jury, if there's a hung jury, there could be a decision that, we're going to retry the case, or we're going to retry the case on certain counts. Now, it's possible, and this is one of the things we need to look for next week, that there's one juror who says, I have some doubt with respect to whether or not this is murder, but perhaps the prosecution can get a unanimous verdict when it comes to at least the manslaughter charge. At that point, the prosecution would potentially say, are we going to retry the murder charges? And then, of course, there's everything that happens outside the outside the courtroom. I say classroom too often, obviously, in my other life as a professor, which is will there be civil unrest? We saw in the beginning that already there are protests in a lot of major cities. I'm talking to you from Los Angeles. The sheriff has already talked about what the potential response would be. And I think that's understandably something that we're going to be looking for.
And Jessica, let's just zoom out for a minute. In legal terms, what is it about the uniform and badge that gives police extra protection in a case like this one? And how might those norms be changing?
I think that those norms might be changing on both the state and federal level. But to take the first part of your question first, how do we see protection for police officers who are accused of misconduct? Well, first, it's just our burdens of proof when it comes to criminal law. Any defendant, before we do the most serious thing, which is take away their liberty, we have to have a unanimous jury verdict beyond a reasonable doubt. What else do we see when it comes to police officers specifically? A lot of times we ask whether or not they used excessive force, and that's according to a reasonable person standard. Now, that's something that police officers have a lot of protection in terms of saying, this is based on my training. This is based on what I've been told. And if you were in my position at that time, you would have made the same decision. So there's a lot of protection that police officers get out of that reasonable person standard, out of that excessive force standard, and out of the training that they're given, where they can point to the training and say, look, if you have a problem with what I did, then you need to go back to the officers who told me that this is within what the department finds acceptable. You asked me what's going to happen going forward. There's federal legislation that's pending. It doesn't look good in the Senate for this legislation, but it would do things like create a federal registry of police misconduct. It would say no more chokeholds, no more no-knock warrants. It would talk about more civilian oversight. And I believe there's 130 different bills that have been proposed on the state level, giving state governments a lot more oversight into police departments and police unions, looking at some of the same things, more oversight, more transparency, changing disciplinary actions, things like body cameras. And I think that this is the moment where, again, 130 bills, pending federal legislation, I think this is the moment where we could see real change.
130 bills. All right, Jessica Levinson, thank you.
Thank you.